The people who were alive in the 1960s produced carbon dioxide as they burned fossil fuels to meet their needs. They burned coal to create the electricity which powered their homes, their businesses, their schools. They used petroleum to power their cars. The land that they cut and deforested then absorbed less carbon dioxide from the air. The agriculture that they used to produce their food released carbon dioxide. And thus, carbon dioxide levels gradually increased during the 1960s. Not only did human activity increase carbon dioxide levels, but the human populations grew and grew. So human population was around 3 billion people in 1959, but by 1969 it was 3.6 billion people. Over half a billion people were added to global population during this decade. And global carbon dioxide levels rose from 316 parts per million in 1959 to 324 parts per million in 1969. This trend continued in the 1970s. People still needed electricity, and so they still burned coal and returned carbon dioxide to the air. People still needed gas, and so they burned petroleum and put carbon dioxide into the air. More areas were deforested, and less carbon dioxide was taken out of the air. And the population continued to grow. It was 3.7 billion people in the year 1970. It was 4.4 billion, more than half a billion more, by the end of the decade. As a result, during the 1970s, carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere rose steadily from 326 parts per million to 337 parts per million. As of the 1980s, the planet was becoming measurably warmer, in that, as of 1980 meant several of the warmest years had occurred in the 1970s, and since the mid-1970s onward, every single year would be warmer than the 20th century average. More carbon dioxide was released during the 1980s as more electricity was produced from coal, as more gasoline was burned for cars, as more deforestation occurred, and as population continued to grow. So the population of 4.4 billion when the decade of the 1980s began was 5.2 billion by the end of the 1980s, and the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere had increased from 339 parts per million to 353 parts per million. As of the 1990s, most of the warmest years on record had occurred in the 1980s. And during this decade, more carbon dioxide was released into the air because more electricity was produced, more gasoline was used, more deforestation occurred, and during this decade, global population continued to grow from 5.3 billion to more than 6 billion people for the first time in Earth's history. As a result, the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere increased from 353 parts per million to 368 parts per million. As of the year 2000, all of the warmest years on record had occurred either in the 1980s or the majority in the 1990s. During this decade, more carbon dioxide was released through the production of electricity, through the use of gasoline, through deforestation, and the global population continued to rise from 6.1 billion individuals to more than 6.8 billion individuals. As a result, in this decade, the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere continued to grow from 370 parts per million to 387 parts per million. All of these trends continued in the year following 2010. By the year 2014, all of the hottest years had occurred since the year 2000, except for the exceptionally warm year of 1998. 2014 was the warmest year on record until 2015, which was the warmest year on record, until the year 2016, which was the warmest year on record. During these years, human population rose above 7 billion individuals for the first time in human history. And carbon dioxide levels not only crossed the 400 parts per million, but rose above 410 parts per million. In other words, since humans started measuring carbon dioxide levels in the year 1959, about a quarter of the carbon dioxide was added since then through human activity. Thus, given that carbon dioxide is a heat-absorbing gas, the fact that a quarter of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is new since the late 1950s is certainly a reason for concern, and certainly correlated to the rise in temperature which has occurred over this time period.